talk about ethics from another angle. It's mind-boggling how many principles and guidelines and frameworks are available on how to be an ethical organization, creating ethical cultures, or delivering ethical technologies. AI ethicist reports 228 ethical principles for AI alone, and there's many hundreds more not on their list and many thousands more in different sectors. But interestingly, pretty much all of these start top down with high-level principles and values. Very easy to talk about, and I've done a few of those myself in my time. Very interesting to do. But then some poor devil has to make them happen in real life in the organization. They have to design the rules, the communications, the compliance mechanisms, the incentives, disincentives, the training, which encourages or even compels people to do one thing and not another thing. And that is really much harder. But this is where the work of my guest today comes in. He helps organizations look at ethics from another angle, the bottom up, the humans delivering against the principles that have been created from the top. Christian Hunt specializes in human risk, and that is the risk of people doing the things they shouldn't do or not doing the things they should do, or you want them to do. He's also the author of a great new book called Humanizing Rules, which is a really helpful and practical guide to designing rules and processes that help make ethics stick in organizations. Christian was previously a managing director and head of behavioural science at UBS. Prior to that, COO of the Prudential Regulation Authority, a subsidiary of the Bank of England responsible for regulating financial services, where he helped shape regulation after the financial crash of 2008. There's a job. He knows a lot about designing rules with real experience at the sharp end of what works and what doesn't. Christian, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Hilary.
Now, let's start then with an introduction to human risk and what that is and how that relates to ethics generally, if you would.
Yeah, so human risk came from a realization I had, and you talked about my career path, where I had a very unusual experience of eating my own regulatory cooking, in that I had joined the regulator, always have to stress, post the 2008 crisis. And I joined in supervision, which is the bit of the regulator that faces off against firms, and spent most of my time focusing on one firm. And as your listeners who work in regulated industries will be aware, if a regulator is looking at you, it's not because you're doing a great job. And the firm that I spent most of my time looking at as a regulator was UBS. So I had something like a rogue trader to deal with within 7 days of taking my role, a ton of things that were not going right in that firm. And so I spent a lot of time looking at what was happening there. I then became COO of the regulator and realized that I wasn't cut out to be a central banker. And so I did something very unusual, because many countries you can't do this. But in the UK, you are allowed to go from the regulator to regulatees and vice versa. The idea being you get a flow of understanding on both sides. And I had this unique experience of eating my own regulatory cooking, in that I was working in risk and compliance, having to implement rules that I had imposed on the firm. And what I started to realize there was that we really weren't landing in the way that had been intended. The regulatory concepts had been passed down to the firm, and they had various restrictions and rules placed on them, as well as the general rules that apply to everybody, with a view to preventing the mistakes of the past. And what was happening was it wasn't landing with people. So I was being sent on training by myself, because I get an email from myself as the head of compliance and risk telling me to go on a particular training course. So I go on this training course, and it didn't really do anything for me, or I'd own policies and rules that I didn't really understand or see the point of. And it helped that I was in one part of the business that was distant from where all the things had gone wrong. So I was responsible for the asset management business, which just hadn't had any issues. And so lots of rules were being imposed on the asset management business that worked very well for the investment bank or wealth management where there'd been issues. And so I was stuck with this problem of owning some rules and processes that I understood the genesis of and had been partly responsible for, but I just saw weren't working as designed. And then the second realization I had was that whenever things went wrong, there was always a human component involved, either people causing problems in the first place or making them worse by the way they reacted or didn't react to them. And suddenly there's this light bulb moment that what we're missing with all of this is the human element of it, that we're not thinking about the people that are at the end of all of these things, the people that have to follow our rules, the people that have to attend our training, the people that make decisions on a day-to-day basis. that can determine whether an organization is ethical or not, those are the people that we need to get to and we need to influence. And yet that wasn't happening. And I sort of realized this wasn't a criticism of UBS. This was just generally the way we went about solving this problem. And I think, to be honest, Hilary, I got to a stage in my career where I realized that I couldn't just let this lie, and I had to do something about it. And so I was trying to square this circle about how do we do this? And in trying to get attention for this, I came up with this idea of human risk. I thought, well, if I could have a snappy title for it internally and I define it in the right way, I can talk about this being the largest risk facing the firm. Because of this, humans are always involved in these pieces. And so began an adventure that I started at UBS and then took to the wider world in 2019 of looking at this challenge of saying, in the 21st century, we employ human beings to do things that technology can't. If a task is predictable, repeatable, we tend to give it to technology. And if we don't do it at the moment, we will do that. And so what are we getting people to do? Well, the answer is things that involve nuance, judgment, emotional intelligence, personality. And so that's when humans are at their best, but it's also when they pose the largest amount of risk. It's also when they start thinking creatively and sort of doing interesting things. And so the challenge I see in the 21st century is really, how do we get the best out of our people? And so human risk is a simple formulation that says, look, if we're employing people, i.e. most organizations at the moment, then we need to be thinking about the risks that they pose. And if we recognize that they pose a risk, and people often talk about, people are our biggest asset. And that's correct. It's a positive frame. The negative framing is people are your largest risk. And so if we want to think about what that means, well, we better start to understand people and what drives them to make the decisions that they make. And let's have a realistic view of what drives those humans' decisions, not what we would like to have driving those decisions, but actually what is likely to drive those decisions. And then we can start to try and influence that more effectively. And so what I start to look at under the human risk banner is to say, well, let's recognize situations when humans might do something that we don't want or not do something that we do want them to do. And then try and design an environment. And that includes, I use the term rule. My book is called Humanizing Rules, but rules is really a proxy for everything, for any attempt to influence people. So yes, rules, policies, procedures, obviously, but also the design of controls, the design of communication, the design of training, anything that we are doing to try and influence people, to look at it and say, how can we do that more effectively to recognize the challenge we're posing? So if we take ethics as one of many topics that human risk covers, what we'd be saying there is, what ethical outcomes do we want? Let's identify who the people are that might make decisions. And of course, every single employee has a potential to make unethical decisions, but there will be particular moments where that risk is enhanced. So let's say to ourselves, which people do we need to influence? Under what circumstances do we need to influence them? What might they do that we don't want them to do, not do that we do want them to do? And let's think about intelligent ways of getting through to them. And let's use a very broad toolkit to do that, where we recognize that sometimes the answer will be training. Sometimes we need to just literally stop them from being able to do it. Sometimes it'll be awareness training. Sometimes it might be overriding their natural tendency. It might well be that a natural tendency of someone in a particular situation is exactly what you don't want them to do. But in other situations, you might want them to do exactly, their natural inclination may be exactly the thing that you do want them to do. And so if we start to think about ethics as a behavioral challenge, we can start to see that we need a broad range of tools to be able to manage this. And we really need to understand what makes people tick, and therefore how we can influence that in a positive way.
Fantastic, thank you. And what I also liked about your book too, which I saw more clearly, is that, and this happens with ethics and other areas of compliance, is, are we concentrating on trying to prevent one bad actor, or are we really helping an organization get the best out of the majority of people who don't act unethically deliberately? Various organizational issues or personal issues or incentive issues steer them unethically. And I was quite intrigued that you really take that approach, don't you? That actually it's all about helping good people do things well.
Yeah, and I start from the very simple premise that says when we think about this problem, it's much easier for us to think about, well, bad things happen because we've got bad actors doing bad things. And of course, that's reinforced. If you think about the movies, that's always reinforced in that. And you know, we sort of have the goodies and the baddies and these evil villains doing terrible things. You know, James Bond would be a prime example of where that sort of stereotyping happens. And so we tend to think about these things. And of course, those people do exist. There will be people within any organization that are, for a multitude of reasons, setting out to deliberately break rules and do bad things. And of course, we need to stop those people, and we need to catch them, and we need to prevent them, and all those sorts of things. But that's not the majority of people. It's a very, very small percentage of people. There will, of course, be the opposite end of the spectrum, which is the people that never, ever, ever do anything wrong, goody two shoes. They're also suspicious, by the way. We should watch that, because that's not normal either. But those two groups of people we should put aside, because if you think about something like training, if I'm setting out to do the wrong thing, I'm not paying these. I'm not trainable. I'm not listening to anything you're saying. The only time I might, I'll show up to training in order to be seen to be there, so I don't appear on your radar. And I might be paying attention to see what loopholes I can find. And I'll be reading policies to see what loopholes I can find to get away with whatever it is I want to get away with. So these people aren't trainable. And so what we need to be thinking about is to say, look, if the vast majority of people we know will, show up to work to try and do the right thing if circumstances permit. So let's try and focus on that. Now, if we send a signal to them that we don't trust them, that we think they are all criminals or potential criminals, then at some point they're going to respond in kind. And we all know this from our personal relationships with other people. This is your specialism is, trust. Well, we return, you don't trust me. Well, I'm going to return the favor. Thank you very much. And so I think the focus that we have is very understandably the bad actor looms large in our thinking. But actually, that's incredibly unhelpful, because what we need to start thinking about is to say, how do we get to the vast majority of people who, given the chance, would do the right thing? And let's try and steer them in the right direction. We won't do that if we send a signal to them that they're not trusted. And therefore, that's the big risk I see in that focal point. And I've got to emphasize here, what I'm saying is catch the bad actors by different means. That's what you have monitoring and other programs for. But if we're looking at things like training and designing processes, let's start from the premise that people are doing it for the right reasons. And one of the other reasons that we would want to do that is if we can make it as easy as possible for people to do the right thing, then when we have people doing the wrong thing, we've removed air cover, because what we've basically done is we've made the path of doing the right thing obvious and clear. And so anybody that doesn't do it, you've removed all their excuses. Whereas actually, if we're focusing on making everything, the focal point is around all the bad people, you often design processes that give, let's have incredibly long sets of rules that people can say, well, that was a bit confusing. I didn't really understand that. You provide air cover for these bad actors. And so I like this positive message of let's focus on the people that are, to all intents and purposes, trying to do the right thing and facilitate that and make sure that happens.
Absolutely. Really interesting. And I'm going to steal my favorite line in your whole book. But what you've said, which I really like, if you have one person that breaks a rule, you have a people problem. If you've got lots of people breaking a rule, you have a rule problem. And I think I really like that idea that actually, concentrating on the single person is wrong. Concentrating on what works and what doesn't work, and looking a bit more closely at how that works. Tell us more about how actually you've been doing that.
Yeah, so the logic for that, and what I actually say is I need to just correct it slightly. I say if one or two people break a rule, then you've probably got a people problem. If lots of people are breaking a rule, you've got a rule problem. Now, the reason I say one or two people and probably is that the simple thing I'm drawing there is to say, look, if the vast majority of people are able to comply with the rule, then that kind of suggests that the people that aren't doing it don't really have a good excuse. Now, there will always be exceptions to that, right? There may be people that are in a unique set of circumstances that actually it's not, there is a reason why they can't comply with that rule. But broadly speaking, we can take as feedback, behavioral feedback, the fact that if lots of people are, lots of people are able to do it and one or two can't, well, then that suggests that there's something that those people are somehow responsible for that piece. The flip side of that then is to say, well, actually, if you've got lots and lots of people breaking, it's unlikely that you are going to have hundreds of employees within your organization deliberately setting out to break a rule. So there will be some underlying reason why that is happening. Now, the rule might itself not be the problem. It might be that you trained them 8 years ago and expected them to remember. Maybe the rule is very difficult to comply with. Maybe there's a set of circumstances in which the rule isn't clear or actually shouldn't apply because it's stopping something legitimate from happening that you haven't previously considered. And so what I say with these things is look at it as a sense of feedback. And I got to this logic by thinking about traffic. And so many of the things that occur to me is I try and look for parallel universes, other circumstances that aren't necessarily badged as ethics, where we try and influence human decision making, and maybe we've gone about it in a particular way that can help us to think about the challenges that we're facing in the ethics sphere. And so if you think about traffic, it occurred to me that we have two things that we do. The first one is the sort of speed camera mentality, where we'll have a stretch of road and we will put speed cameras on there, and we will take pictures of drivers that are speeding, and we will punish those drivers to try and deter drivers from speeding on that stretch of road. Very sensible, because drivers are the unit of risk. If you can get the driver to behave correctly, they won't speed, and therefore you will reduce the risk of accidents. So we hold people accountable for their actions. But we also do something else, which is we say, look, if there is a stretch of road, a junction maybe, where there are lots of accidents and lots of issues, we don't just blame the drivers. We also think about, well, what is it about this junction that's posing the problem? And we then probably change the structure of the junction, put more signs up, slow traffic down. We do things to the physical environment in order to reduce the possibility of accidents. And it may just be a simple case of putting up a sign saying, watch out, lots of accidents happen here. But generally speaking, when it's a big issue, we change the architecture to do. And I thought that's really interesting, because we don't pin all of it on drivers. We recognize that there are going to be some, maybe there are trees that are blocking you. You can't see around a blind corner. Maybe there are trees blocking signs. There'll be certain cues that mean that's why drivers don't set out to have accidents. And so as I thought about that, I thought that's sort of interesting, because the same thing I think applies when we think about rules. Back to that idea of, we haven't hired a bunch of people, hopefully, that are deliberately setting out to break our rules. If we have, then we've got a recruitment issue. But generally speaking, we haven't got that problem. And so I thought, well, actually, why can't we take that same idea of changing the environment and deploy it in the context of rules? And if you think about it in those terms, actually, then you can start to say, yes, of course, we hold people accountable for their individual behaviors. So the speed camera mentality absolutely does apply. And if I discover that one person is breaking lots of rules, then that is a problem. Or if people are an anomaly where everybody else is managed to become, we should look at that, and we should probably approach it with a speed camera mentality. But I like this idea of, well, here's the particularly dangerous stretch of road that we also change, and we focus on that as well. And so that's how I sort of came to that piece. And I think if we start to it's uncomfortable, and the reason I think organizations don't do it is because you then have to admit that there's a little bit of organizational culpability. Because if you then decide your conclusion is we've got to change a rule, change a process, we've got to do something, implicitly, therefore, the structures that you had in place before were contributing to the problem. And that's not a comfortable discussion. But I'm not here to make life comfortable. I'm here to try and help people to solve problems. And I think recognizing that often we can design things with the best intentions that don't work out the way we expected, and being prepared to admit that and course correct, I think, is one of the most powerful ways that we can solve these challenges.
Absolutely. Really interesting. I mean, one of the things too, I was intrigued by your job title. Quite early on, you were head of behavioural science. Now, behavioural science is all over the place at the moment, sometimes being used, in my view, very weirdly, and sometimes not. But I like very much about how you talked about behavioural science in your book, very, very straightforward, very helpfully. And looking at then, so you're looking at your rules with those behavioural lenses in mind. Tell us a bit more about, the practicalities of that.
Yeah, and it really came about the job and the genesis of the way that I think about the world and some of the work that I do now was really looking and saying, okay, if I've recognized I'm trying to influence people, suddenly you can start to look at other context, back to the traffic example I've just given, you can look at other contexts where we're influencing people, and we might not call it ethics, we might not call it compliance, we might call it something completely different, but we use techniques in other fields to influence humans to behave in a particular way. And so if we start to look at the behavioral challenge that we have, remove the context, and suddenly you can start to spot other ways of doing it. And so really, the first point was to think about, or say, is this actually delivering what I think it's delivering? And so, one of the logical things that we often do is we say, well, we need them to understand this. So we're going to send them on a training course to understand this. They have attended the training course. They now understand this. Now, that may or may not be true. Yes. But what we don't think about is, do they agree with this? Do they understand the rationale behind this? Have they understood the theory but not the practice of this? So attending a training course, having a bum on a seat or having a pair of eyes staring at a screen and some fingers on a keyboard does not guarantee that you have got through to these people. And so we need to start, it's a helpful metric. It's an easy metric to say everybody has done the training, but actually has that training been effective? And very often we're not really, it's almost the job is done when they've shown up. And so what I started to look at is to say, well, actually, does this equip people with the things that we need? Does this work in the way that we'd intended? Is that email that we're sending out, is that sending the right signal, or are they going to read it in a completely different way? Are they going to read it at all? Is this landing in the way that we want? Now, the challenge that we often have is that things that we think work don't actually work that effectively. And, the best example of that is if we look at the world of advertising, there are lots of advertisements out there that make no sense whatsoever. I mean, think about jingles, for example. Why does my propensity to buy a product increase if I recognize the branding, the logo, the jingle? It's got nothing to do with the quality of the product. There is something there that's not logical. It's working on an emotional level. And so I just thought, well, we can start to deploy, just look at what goes on elsewhere. And I'm not saying we don't necessarily need a branding or a logo or a jingle, but just the idea that there are other factors at play that we can use. And so recognizing one, where there may be better ways of doing things that are more behaviorally effective, but probably more importantly is to look at where have we got unintended consequences? Where have we got things happening that were not in the plan, that the theory of how we've influenced people just isn't working. And so you can start to recognize this very easily. And there are lots of things that we do. And regulators don't help here, by the way, because often regulators ask for things that don't work well from a behavioral perspective. So we've got that second challenge of how do we keep them happy? But or even people that, if you're sort of sitting in the C-suite, you might have a view as to what the most effective way of influencing people is. But actually, that's not necessarily what really does influence people. And so what I started to do was to think creatively about how do we solve the problems that we have and really get through to the people that's there? And how do we know that we're being effective? And one of the interesting things, when I talk to people about behavioral science, lots of people say, well, how do you know that's effective? And I say, well, how do you know what you're doing at the moment is effective? And so we should apply the same standards to new ways of doing things as we apply to existing ways. And typically what we find is the only way historically that we've known whether things are working or not is when things have gone wrong. Now, that's not a great way of looking at the world, because, it would sort of be saying, well, I think our traffic safety program's working really well, but we'll find out when we work out, whether we've had any accidents. That's not a great way of approaching the world. And so what I like to try and do is to people is to say, look, let's think really carefully about what outcome are we looking to achieve? What situations might that outcome occur in? And let's think about the real world, right? Let's not think about a sort of hypothetical, nice, easy to organize world. And often we send people on training for what I call sort of murder is bad training, where we tell people, there's a question, what do you do in this situation? And it's a situation that nobody needs any help with, right? Because it's blindingly obvious what the right answer is. That's not what people need help with from an ethical perspective. What they need help with is the gray area, the bits that are a bit confusing, the bits that aren't obvious to them. And so that's what we need to focus on. We need to recognize where people might make a misstep, not, back to my earlier point, because they're setting out to screw something up, but actually because, we all have competing propositions. We all have off moments. We can be tired. We might not be thinking straight. And the one line that I always say to compliance people, to ethics people, is to say that the average employee is not interested in ethics or compliance. I don't mean they're not interested in behaving ethically or compliantly. What I mean is they're not interested in the subject matter in detail. How do I know that? Well, if they were, they'd be working in the ethics or the compliance function, right? They're not. They're working in sales or marketing or whatever their job is. So their primary interest and their primary focus is doing that job. All of these other things that we want them to do, yes, they're important. And of course, if they had bandwidth and capacity to think about these things, they would think about them, but they've got other things to prioritize. And so we need to plug into their world and we need to meet them and think about the realities of their existence. And that's where I would say something like advertising, you won't sell a product if you don't market it to people and you don't explain to them how it fits into their existence. How is this going to make their lives better? And I would argue we have the same challenge with ethics, is we want to try and, if we're introducing concepts and ideas and frameworks and tools and training, let's be realistic about the world that they are operating in and make sure that we make it as relevant as possible and we make it as helpful to them as possible. In other words, we speak their language, not ours. We communicate to them about situations that they will recognize that are realistic. And if we start thinking in those terms, we can suddenly start to evolve programs that are more effective. So behavioral science for me is is part of a toolkit that also includes things like creativity. Now, let's think differently about how we solve the problems, because if it's not working now, doing more of the same thing is unlikely to get a different outcome.
Absolutely. I mean, I like that too about, ethics training is one of those ones, but, you get sent on your ethics training, tick the box, let's go. And I mean, there's lots of very creative and wonderful work being done in that now. So I'm not suggesting this is as much as it would have been a few years ago. But I think, what you said there, we're so focusing on what we want them to know and then saying it, that we forget about how it's received. And I love that. It's a great book, but written by the guy that used to be the star of MASH, Alan Alda, and his book is, If I Understood You, Would I Have This Look on My Face? And so it's the job of the communicator to be understood, not the job of the person being communicated to understand. And we do forget that. I mean, and things are not designed, as you are doing, with people and all of our very busy foibles and our conflicting incentives in mind. And so I really like that too. And so one of the things when we're looking at the behavioural science side, it's quite difficult. I like the way you talk in detail about, you have a rule and how you pick it apart and how you don't scrutinize what works and what doesn't work. Because it's just too difficult, it's too complicated. So can you talk us through a bit how you've done that in certain situations with certain types of rules, and even any applications we have for the financial crash where rules were, lacking in certain ways, and what lessons you've learned from that?
Yeah, so I think, let's start with something where we already have an existing attempt to solve a problem. So maybe we're trying to comply with a rule, or we have an ethical outcome that we're looking, something's gone wrong in the past and we've designed something to try and correct it. And I think one of the important things to think about is to say, well, look, what's the behavior that we are trying to change here? What is it that people are currently doing that we don't want them to do, or there's a risk of them doing that we don't, or alternatively not doing that we do want them to do? And let's have a look at, who those people might be, what the situations are in which they might do that, what the sort of the thought processes that they might go through. In other words, do what we would do for customers. So we try and put ourselves in the customer's shoes to understand lots of conversation about customer experience and customer journey. I think there's the same thing for employees. But we tend not to bother doing that well, because I talk about the employment contract fallacy, right? Which is the idea that because we employ people, we can tell them what to do. Now that's legally correct. We can, but it's a fallacy because it's not desperately effective if we spend our whole time effectively saying to people, because of the employment contract, you are going to do this thing that you don't understand, don't know, just do it. We can get away with a certain amount of that, and we will need to use a certain amount of that. And there are particular contexts, for example, things that are matters of health and safety, where that overrides everything else. You say, look, this just absolutely has to happen. But when we're thinking about things like ethics, which is a bit more nebulous, shouting at people, mandating them to be ethical, that's fraught with difficulty, particularly where we can't necessarily police it. We may only find out afterwards that they've been in a meeting and done something, or they've taken a decision that wasn't one that we would have wanted. So we need their buy-in. And so really looking and saying, can we understand the realities of what these people are doing? And a key component of that is to start reflecting on how they will see it. And I don't mean how we would like them to see it. I mean genuinely how they are likely to see it. And that leads us into, and I have various frameworks that help us to think about this, questions of, for example, do they genuinely understand what it is we are asking them to do? And equally, do they know that we understand what we're asking? Because one of the things that's really irritating is if somebody's asked me to do something and I think they have no understanding of what they're asking, that's very annoying. And so we should focus on that and say, well, actually, do they have a sense of why this matters to them? Do they understand what it is we're trying to do? Because often when you want people to do something, they may need an understanding of the logic behind it, the spirit of the law as well as the letter of the law, if you like. And so we're looking at some questions like that. We're also looking at how easy is it for them to do? Because something that's a pain in the backside, we are less likely to want to do than something that's easier for us. And so really focusing on the genuine experiences of the individual, their likelihood of sort of accepting our authority in this particular field. The example I always quote, is to say, well, lots of organizations have social media policies. In other words, they impose rules on what their employees can and can't do on social media. And depending on what industry you're working in, you may have a different view on that. If you work for the security services, you may think it's perfectly reasonable that your employer bans you from having any social media because that could expose you to risk. But if you happen to work for an ordinary company, if they turn around to you and say you may not have a LinkedIn account or a Facebook account, that might feel like overreach. And so understanding that might one lead us then to change what it is we demand of people. We may say to ourselves, actually, they are going to find that so challenging, so difficult. That's probably a step too far. Maybe we shouldn't do that. Or we say to ourselves, actually, we really need this. This is really important. So we're going to recognize that if there is a big gap between what we would like and what they are likely to do, then we need to think about how we close that gap, or we need to monitor it because it poses a bigger risk. And so it's not about saying the employees should have it all their own way, but we should factor in where there is a bigger gap between what the outcome we're looking for and the outcome that they are likely to produce for us, being realistic about what that looks like. And then we can start to say, well, what risks are we running here? What's actually, how can we best manage this particular challenge? And often we treat all sort of ethical principles or rules as being equally valid. I would say there are certain things where it's not difficult to impose on people at all. They will completely understand why you're doing it. They will intuitively get it. They may just need a little reminder or a little pointing out of something that may not be obvious to them, but they're on board. There are going to be other things where they're going to go, that is a pain in the backside, and how dare they tell me to do that, and I don't need this sort of thing, and that's going to restrict my ability to do business, and that's going to prevent me from selling to certain things, and it causes angst and anguish. And if we start to recognize those sorts of rules, requirements, impositions on people, then we can say, well, actually, that potentially poses a larger risk to our organizational efforts. And so I think understanding behaviorally, what people's propensity in the loosest sense of the word to comply or to follow our principles is, then we can start to deploy our efforts much more intelligently. And maybe we need less training, less of the murder is bad training and more of the kind of, actually, we're not patronizing you here because this is really difficult. And you may find yourself in a position where you're under huge amounts of pressure and you may, in the heat of the moment, you might not spot this. So we're going to talk you through what you do if you find yourself in this particular situation. And let's have some really sensible practical advice for how you manage that. And so spending more time on those things and less time on the obvious things, is a better deployment of resources. If you looked at any other form of risk, you would manage the risk appropriately. You would deploy resources at the things that pose the greatest amount of risk to the organization. And I think the way we can measure that is to say, what's the behavioral gap between what we're looking for them to do and what is we want them to. And of course, when it comes to ethics, there are certain things where it's very, very clear what the right answer is. And it's going to be consistently clear. So closer to what you might term the laws of physics, where those don't change. And so there'll be certain ethical things that are obvious and very clear and very straightforward. And, so if we looked at sanctions, for example, we don't want there's certain types of business that we just will not do. And there is no question about that. And therefore, that's not the kind of business that we want to do, either with sanctioned parties or from an ethical principle. We don't get involved with the following industries. And you can be very, very clear about that. And that's very easy to codify. There are going to be other things that are a bit more nuanced and a bit more, require a bit more thought. And we need people to be. So we can, I think we should focus more effort on helping people through those difficult bits, rather than spending equal effort telling them stuff that's blindingly obvious.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, I bang on lots of my podcasts about how at the moment we seem to be trying to make people more like machines and machines more like people. But I have some sort of sympathy with machines. In theory, they just do as they're blooming told, and you just do that and it happens. Whereas people, it's all so difficult and so messy. But what I like about your book and your approach is recognizing that, finding, looking at people for what they do bring and looking for machines with what they do bring and making the most out of both. And I think too, finding ways of how to understand what might go wrong, what could go wrong, in creative and interesting ways. I liked your idea of, ethical hackers or red team thinking and all of that type of thing. And so practical ways of trying to find out what the risk might be. Give us some more examples of that.
Yeah, and so one of the simple things that I think we miss is that people give us clues ahead of time that they might do something that we don't want. And so, if we think about when people commit fraud, people generally don't jump in and commit massive amounts of fraud as their first attempt, right? They'll take baby steps in that direction. And then as they spot loopholes and it becomes easier for them, then the numbers go up and they start to create justifications and it becomes a habit. And so we know that from lots of other contexts. And so one of the things that I've said is if we could start to look for the equivalent of poker tells in our population that say, look, there are things that the population are doing that if we paid attention to them, we would have an indication of where we might have down the line, or we might already have, but we just haven't spotted it yet, a behavioral problem. So, one of the things that I think is interesting is looking at the interactions that people have with the organization and how they react to rules and regulations and training and all those sorts of things. And so, a good example would be we often don't capture complaints about rules or training. And so the reason and the logic behind that is, well, it's tough, right? They have to attend this stuff. I don't need to. This is mandatory, so they're just going to do it. And we back to the employment contract fallacy. And I think it's actually quite helpful to try and record some of this stuff and say, look, if you're getting lots of complaints about something, then in the same way that that's worth paying attention to if you have customers, customers complaining about something because that could be the reason they stop using your service or stop buying your product. Same thing's true internally is if I really hate a rule, I think a rule is stupid and I don't respect it, then what is the rule that I'm likely to bend or break when push comes to shove? Well, chances are it's the one I've been complaining about. And so those complaints, I'm not saying it automatically means that when someone is whinging about a particular thing that they will, but this is where that, again, thinking about the collective, if you've got, one person who's banging on about something a lot, then maybe you can ignore that one person. But if lots of people are telling you that a rule is stupid, or they don't really understand it, or they find it deeply irritating, then that's a pretty good indicator that, again, it's behavioral feedback. I also like when look at the volume of inbound questions that we're getting, and that might be questions posed to ethics or compliance officers. That might be people looking at policies and rules on the intranet. We can track that stuff, and if we start to track that stuff, you'd say, well, what patterns might we be expecting? And so if we looked at, for example, around the holiday season, that's a time when lots of gifts are given. So it would be logical to assume that might be a time when people maybe want to refresh their knowledge of the gifts and entertainment policy. And so we could say, well, are we seeing an uptick in that space? Now, I'm not drawing the conclusion that just because there is an uptick in it, that's good news, or there isn't an uptick, and they all understand the rules, so they don't need to look at it, or maybe they're looking at it because the rules are incredibly confusing. I don't conclude as to what the data tells us, but it's useful data that we don't generally think to capture. And so we say to ourselves, what might this data be telling us? And so, I would look at it and just simply say, are humans behaving in the way that we might expect? And then the question comes, is it actually explainable in the sense that our preconceptions about what they ought to do turn out to be wrong because actually we've misunderstood something? Well, that's useful information. If we investigate, that's useful information. Or is it that actually, hold on a minute, there's a pattern of behavior here that just looks really odd? Well, let's go investigate why that is. And I think if we do that, we get a better understanding about what the population is up to, and therefore what makes them tick. And therefore we can design. So even if we don't learn, we don't make any great discovery, we're learning more about the people that we're trying to influence and the way that they do their work. And that will allow us, in the same way that we do, we get lots of data about customers. If I look at Amazon collecting tons of data about what people are looking at, where they go, all that sort of thing, why don't we do the same thing with our quote unquote services and see what they're looking at? And that starts to give us some useful information. Now, you have to be smart about how you use that and how we think about it, but there's lots of untapped information. And because most interactions are digital now, we have the option of collecting this stuff. And the great news is, if we collect it on an aggregated basis, in other words, I'm not looking, the traditional logic would be wheedle out the individuals. I'm not interested in that. What I want to know is big picture patterns, where I can say, this is where the herd is moving on this issue. Are there lots of people doing something or not doing something? And that gives us some early behavioral cues. And if we investigate those, we can start to discover things before they go wrong, rather than having that presented just neatly on a platter afterwards.
And it sort of stands to reason you would want to do that, but it's quite surprising how often that doesn't happen. And as you say, I like this idea of tells, or sort of leading indicators, trying to see, what should we be looking at, and what can you construe to that? Not that you can necessarily predict big disasters from small things, but I loved also your point in the book about compliance and ethics, and how we ourselves wriggle our way into making perhaps slightly unethical decisions or rule decisions. So you're saying, if we want to, your findings of the justifications, if we want to justify doing something that breaks a rule, we tend to do so by referencing ethics. And conversely, if we want to justify doing something unethical, we tend to do so by reference to compliance. And that really brought home to me. So talk to me a bit about that, about this justification thing and how difficult it is for people.
Yeah, so it's a very simple. I was sort of reflecting on it and thinking, well, one of the challenges that we have when we're looking at the field of ethics is that it's not, back to your earlier point, it's not about programming a machines. We have views on things and we think about stuff, and we're very, very good at justifying our actions. And I started to think about it, started with a period of self-reflection, actually, about sort of, well, when I've broken rules, and I say when, because we all do, or when I've been unethical, what was I thinking? And it always, and the most obvious example of this is breaking a speed limit. Right, which anybody who's driven will at some point have broken the speed limit, and the rationale that we will tend to come up with will be something along the lines of, well, what, why that was okay, and so it was the middle of the night, and so there was no one around, i.e. the rule didn't really apply under these circumstances, and that's why I did it. And then the flip side there is to sort of say, well, okay, if I've broken something, I've done something I shouldn't have done, you can sort of point and say, well, there wasn't a rule that told me I couldn't do that. And so we see lots of people making excuses, saying, well, if they didn't want that, they would have created a rule against it. And so it's one of the arguments I use against fat rule books. Right, it feels very, very safe. The more rules we have, the safer the world will be. Yeah, but actually, then if you've written a really fat rule book and you haven't covered a particular thing, you've created a massive loophole, because logically speaking, if you've got this massive rules and there isn't one covered, then game on, right? Because you've sent a signal that you've covered everything. And so what we'll tend to do there is to sort of find a way that we can say, well, there wasn't, nobody told me that I couldn't do it. There wasn't a rule that specifically prevented that. Or, the rule was worded. We interpret the way the rule was written to allow us to justify whatever we're doing. So we lean on these alternative things. And so and we'll do it, according to whatever suits us at the time, we'll grab the most convenient rationale that's there. And so as I just reflected on the interaction between these two things, I just thought, well, that tends to be it, right? It tends to be sort of, I'll use weaknesses in the rule book or some sort of ethical override to get me out of whatever problem I'm in. And so if you think in those terms, then you can just go, one, that shows you the interaction between ethics and compliance and how those two things sit next to each other. The second thing is it shows you the challenges of codification. And one of the things I think is really interesting about, ethics versus compliance, and obviously I say versus because lots of compliance rules cover ethical principles. And so particularly if there's been an issue in industry, so banking would be the best example, lots of unethical outcomes. So we create some rules to prevent those in future. So we've codified ethics in that space. The challenge is the more whenever we try and codify things, we've got to be pretty certain that we're covering every possible eventuality. And I think the challenge that we've got with technology is that things that might not have been possible before suddenly become possible. And therefore, in a very crude analysis, rules that worked in an analog world might not work in the digital world. And so we need to be thinking about those things. And so the more we try and codify it, back to your point around humans and machines, the more we try and codify stuff, we've got to recognize that in codifying it, we may be creating loopholes. We may also be missing gaps. And there may be things there that are not codifiable, or if we were to codify them, they would work beautifully in certain circumstances and not in others. And so how do we manage that particular challenge?
Yeah, great. I mean, the self-justification point is great. Because one of the things we see with when risks become disasters is this that cognitive dissonance, the ability to justify ourselves as good people and contort ourselves into some form of thing that makes us know this wasn't our fault and we are good people. There's a self-justification book I read. I must dig it out and get that person on because I love that. I mean, also all of the risk about willful blindness and about conflicting objectives. That's all the human nature. And back to your behavioral science, more empathy and understanding and listening around why we do the way we do, and more help to support us to do things right, I think is the only way through for those types of things, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think particularly if you look at why are we employing people in the 21st century? Back to my earlier comment about tasks that are predictable, we would give to a machine. So we're hiring people to do things where these issues are more likely to be prevalent. And there's a brilliant ad campaign from about 3 years ago that I love showing when I do presentations, which is, it's a Lego ad for International Women's Day. Lego in the 80s, they ran a series of ads with two little girls on it, and they were basically presenting to the implicitly to the parents something that they'd created. It was some sort of model, right? It didn't rate, and it said something along the lines of what it is beautiful. And it was basically, and anybody who's got kids will know this, right? It's the sort of message of no idea what it is, but it's their creation, and isn't it wonderful? And so they produced these ads in the 80s, which were quite forward thinking for that time. And then a couple of years ago, they updated it and made it a much more diverse cast of young girls. And they used some really interesting words, and they sort of almost copied the same slogan, which is what it is creative, what it is innovative, what it is inventive, what it is experimental. And so all these. And I show this one because I think it's a really cool ad. But the second thing is to say those words are exactly what we're hiring people for. And we know that because have a look at job specs out there. They don't say, join us to slavishly follow the rules and do exactly what you're told, because nobody would go and work in that organization. And even the military doesn't do that. And so we know that we're hiring people and we know that through the interview processes that we put them through, we are hiring people for human attributes. And as we look at diversity, really, really important to avoid groupthink. And, if we want organizations to be creative, to serve the needs of a broader range of the population, all of those sorts of things, we need a more diverse set of people in there. So we're bringing in these diversities of perspectives. And so I think one of the challenges that we've got then is that we'll have a lot more humans to think about, a lot more perspectives to reflect on, and lots of our perspectives about what's ethical, come from our own experiences and the way we were brought up. And so when we look at those, that becomes more of a challenging piece. But if you're hiring all these people to do these very human things, when we come along and then try and control that, that's running against the grain of the reason that they were hired. And if most of their if you're hiring people to be creative, then suddenly says, oh, don't be too creative, though, it's running an exact opposite tension of where we're at. And so I think one of the challenges that we're going to start to see going forward is that ethics may well feel, in the same way that compliance has done, it may feel like a little bit of a handbrake that's being applied to the natural flow of business. And so that's why I think one of the challenges that we've got is really to recognize that if we try to codify too much of ethic and don't think about unintended consequences, and don't recognize that what we're actually doing is experimenting with influencing people. Any attempt to influence people is by default an experiment. Now marketing gets this, because what they do, you don't put an ad campaign out there without having tested it on an audience, and you are not allowed to spend money in ad land without having some good some rationale. Why I want to spend $1 million on this ad campaign. Well, what evidence do you have this is going to work? And if it doesn't work, you pull the campaign pretty quickly. We don't seem to do that for some reason in the sort of ethics space, because what we sort of say is, well, we need to get people to be ethical, and you don't have to think about, well, how is this working? Is it landing? The monitoring tends to be, are they doing what we want them to do? We don't do that thinking that I talked about before, about saying, have we designed this in the most effective way? And so I think an experimental mindset from the sort of ethics and compliance space is absolutely critical for two reasons. One is it puts you in harmony with what the business is doing. As businesses evolve, they are experimenting and doing things. So we need to be adopting a similar mindset for what we do. So R&D, I think, is incredibly important in the compliance and ethics space. The second thing is, that then means that if we've got it wrong, or we need to course correct, we're ready to do that. And we avoid some of those human biases you were talking about, the biases of the sort of presumption that, we've organized this perfect system and now those idiot humans aren't doing what we want. We can sit there and go, hold on a minute, we're now getting enough feedback. There must be something wrong in what we're doing. Let's course correct before something goes hideously wrong. And so recognizing that any attempt to influence people is one, an experiment, but two, will come with what we call in medical terms side effects. So stuff that we didn't want to have happen. Now, side effects are nonsense. It's just a term that we use to justify the stuff that we don't want. They are just as they are effects in the same way as the desired outcome is an effect. They're just things. So we should recognize that those are happening. And so one of the things I always say to my clients is, before you introduce something that's a behavioral intervention, an attempt to influence people in some way, shape, or form, think about the unintended consequences, right? Be cynical about this and say, what is it that this could unleash that we don't want? And the answer isn't nothing, because there will always be, on some level, there will be something that's there, and recognize, is that significant? And if it's so significant, don't do it. But even if it's not significant, is monitor for that. So have a look at it and say, we knew that this was a potential thing that might come off the back. Are we seeing any signs of that? And if you know what you're looking for to start with, you'll have a much better opportunity of catching it if it does start to become an issue.
Absolutely brilliant. And you've come around full circle and talking very much about tech ethics here. This idea of unintended consequences and consequence scanning and all of those types of things, it's just so important. When things go wrong, whether it's it's the Chernobyl, whether it's something to do with the big tech issues of social media, somebody has always been telling you somewhere, if you were prepared to listen to them. But also, you can't do this without being there on the ground, listening to people. And the unintended consequences are usually not tech consequences, they're human consequences. So you come right back to your initial premise, which is, humanizing rules, humanizing organizations, and understanding the way people work and react and interact with, the processes and the individuals within the organization is absolutely essential in terms of doing that, understanding unintended consequences and heading off ethical issues before they become disasters. So that is a fantastic wrap up you've done for us there. And just one final thing then, Christian, if you were to say, to our audience who have got these very complicated organizations, very complicated businesses, what one thing would you say about humanizing rules? What one tip would you give us to sort of help us on our way?
So I think that the number one rule is think about things from the perspective of the people that you're trying to influence. And yes, if you've got a diverse population, different businesses, different locations, this is going to be more challenging. But I think starting to think about things from the perspective of your target audience, your employees, is critical. And in doing that, I'll come back to my number one mantra. Do not think about what you would like people to do. Think about what they are likely to do. Be realistic about what real humans in the real world that's out there are likely to do, and therefore don't have wishful. There's no place for wishful thinking in this. We need to really start to understand that. If we do that, yes, we get overwhelmed by all the things that we need to think about, but we will start to be thinking in the right way because we're starting to think from their perspective, and they're the people that we need to influence. I always say organizations cannot be compliant or ethical of their own accord. It's the people within it that will determine that. We need to be thinking about things from their perspective. The more we do that, the more we are likely to be effective.
Brilliant. Fantastic. What a great end for that. And thank you very much, Christian Hunt. And I would actually like to give a plug for Christian's own podcast. He has the Human Risk podcast. He has a phenomenal number of guests. I've no idea how you do all this and all the work that you do already. So if you want to learn more about that, go pop over to Christian's own podcast as well. Thank you very much, Christian Hunt.
Thank you so much for having me.